The storm outside was the kind that silences everything else, a furious mix of snow and wind that swallowed the entire Alaskan valley. Daniel Carter had lived in this cabin for more than a decade, long enough to know the difference between ordinary weather and a storm that could turn deadly. The wooden beams of his home groaned under the weight of the wind, and ice coated the windows so thickly that he could barely see through them. Yet through the haze of frost, one shape stood out, a towering silhouette, unmoving, deliberate. At first, Daniel's mind scrambled for rational explanations. A neighbor stranded in the blizzard? A lost hiker desperate for help? But as the storm momentarily cleared, the truth came into view, and his body went rigid. Standing against his door was not a human at all, but a wolf, larger than any he had ever seen. Its silver coat weighed down by snow, its golden eyes fixed squarely on him. But this wasn't what froze Daniel's blood. The wolf wasn't snarling or baring its teeth. Instead, it lowered its head and nudged something small forward into the glow of Daniel's porch light. His breath caught. Huddled against the wolf's trembling legs were two fragile pups, their tiny bodies quaking violently from a cold. One collapsed into the drift, barely moving. The mother's reaction was instant. She pushed her muzzle against the limp pup, then turned back to Daniel's window, her eyes locking on his in a way that didn't feel wild. It felt intentional. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. Every instinct told him to back away, to remember that wolves were predators, unpredictable and dangerous. Yet something about the scene refused to let him turn. The mother wasn't hunting. She wasn't attacking. She was asking. Each second stretched painfully thin as the storm raged around them. The pups' small bodies shook harder, and the mother pressed closer to the door, not with aggression, but with desperation. Daniel gripped the edge of the table beside him, torn between fear and the unmistakable truth dawning before his eyes. This wolf wasn't just seeking shelter. She was begging him to save her children. Daniel stood frozen, his pulse pounding louder than the wind outside. Never in his years living in the Alaskan wilderness had he seen an animal behave like this. Wolves were supposed to avoid humans at all costs. Yet here one was pressing her face against his glass, her eyes shining with something Daniel had no word for. Not menace, not hunger, something closer to a plea. The mother wolf shifted again, her paws leaving distinct prints in the snow just beneath his window. Then, with movements so deliberate they seemed almost human, she placed her muzzle gently on her weakest pup, nudging it toward the door. The tiny creature barely stirred, its shallow breaths fogging in the freezing air before vanishing instantly. Daniel swallowed hard. The storm wasn't letting up. If he did nothing, the pup would be dead within minutes. Yet his fear battled every ounce of compassion. Wolves weren't house pets. They were predators, wild and unpredictable. Letting them inside could mean disaster. Still, the mother's behavior was unlike anything he had ever read or heard about. She alternated between curling her body around her shivering pups and turning to Daniel, her golden eyes locked onto his as if willing him to understand. Then came the moment that shattered every doubt he had. Slowly, the wolf sat back on her haunches and raised her front paws, pressing them against the glass in a posture so deliberate it mirrored a human gesture. Not a demand, not aggression, a request. Daniel's throat tightened. His mind screamed that this was impossible. Animals didn't beg. But his heart couldn't deny what his eyes were seeing. The wind howled with renewed fury, rattling the cabin. Snow swirled so thick it looked like a white curtain drawn across the valley. The pups whimpered, their tiny cries piercing through the storm's roar. One of them collapsed again, its frail body sinking into the snow. The mother's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. She scooped up the pup in her jaws, then pressed it gently against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she tried desperately to show Daniel its fading condition. Daniel's hands trembled as he braced against the counter, his eyes stinging with tears. He had seen wolves in the wild, heard their eerie howls under moonlight, even lost a few chickens to them in past winters. But nothing could have prepared him for this moment. For a mother wolf lowering her pride, her instincts, her very nature, to beg a human for help. As if to erase any final doubt, the wolf did something so surreal it made Daniel's knees weaken. She lowered her head to the ground, nudged both pups close, and then bowed. Her ears flattened, her body pressed low in complete submission. For a creature born to roam free, to dominate its territory, this display was unthinkable. She wasn't challenging him. She wasn't intruding. She was surrendering. Daniel's breath came in shallow bursts. His logical mind told him to stay back, to let nature run its course. But another part of him, the part that saw not predators but a desperate mother and her dying children, urged him forward. His hand hovered over the doorknob. If he opened it, his life could change forever. If he didn't, there surely would end. And in that moment, Daniel realized he wasn't the only one making a decision. The wolf was too. Daniel's hand hovered over the doorknob, his pulse racing so violently he thought his chest might burst. Every second mattered. The pups were slipping deeper into the grasp of the storm, and the mother wolf's actions grew more frantic. She pressed her paws against the glass once more, her breath fogging the window in uneven bursts, her eyes burning with urgency. He hesitated, torn between instinct and compassion. One wrong move, and the wolf could see him as a threat. But doing nothing meant watching innocent lives wither in front of him. The choice clawed at his conscience until finally, with trembling resolve, Daniel unlatched the door. The storm blasted inside immediately, biting at his skin like knives. He cracked the door only a few inches, enough to feel the icy wind whip through the cabin. Before he could act, the wolf surprised him again. With careful, almost ceremonial steps, she approached the threshold and gently placed her weakest pup inside. Then she backed away, bowing her head low, as though surrendering the most precious piece of her world into Daniel's care. Daniel scooped the pup into his arms, its body frighteningly limp, its fur crusted with ice. He rushed it toward the fire, wrapping it in an old blanket. Behind him, the mother remained outside, watching with an intensity that froze him more than the storm ever could. She wasn't barging in. She wasn't demanding. She was waiting. The second pup staggered in the snow, collapsing with a pitiful whimper. The mother nosed it toward the doorway, then looked at Daniel, her gaze a silent question. He widened the door, and again, she pushed the pup inside, but did not cross the line herself. Her restraint was staggering, as though she understood the invisible boundary between his world and hers. Daniel placed the second pup beside its sibling, tucking both close to the fire. The heat coaxed weak shudders from their tiny bodies, signs of life, fragile but present. His heart clenched. He glanced back to the door, where the mother stood with her last pup leaning heavily against her. This one was older, larger, but no less vulnerable. Its head drooped, breath shallow. Then the storm surged, driving snow against the house in heavy sheets. The wolf reacted instantly, pressing her last pup to the threshold, nudging it through the gap with desperate urgency. Daniel caught it and laid it gently near the others. His living room, once a place of solitude, now felt like a battlefield between life and death. 3 tiny creatures fought for warmth, and a mother watched, powerless but hopeful. The wolf remained outside, her body trembling not only from the cold, but from the weight of trust she had placed in him. For a long moment, Daniel wondered if she would follow. His hand rested on the door, waiting, inviting. The storm howled mercilessly, snow piling higher against the cabin walls. The wolf's golden eyes met his one final time, searching, questioning, begging. Then she did something that made Daniel's breath hitch. She lowered her head, brushed the snow from her paws, and stepped back, almost as if cleansing herself before entry. Slowly, with a grace that defied her size, she placed one paw across the threshold, then the other, moving with deliberate caution. Her gaze never left Daniel's face, as though silently asking permission with every step. Inside, her presence was overwhelming. The cabin seemed smaller, the air thicker. Yet she did not charge or explore. She went straight to her pups, curling her massive body protectively around them. Her breath washed over their tiny forms, warming them, urging them to cling to life. Daniel stood frozen by the door, unsure whether to feel terror or awe. Every instinct told him to prepare for danger, but the scene before him shattered those fears. This was not a predator invading his home. This was a mother who had chosen trust over instinct, submission over dominance. Minutes dragged into an eternity as the pups stirred, faint movements that drew soft whines from their mother. She licked their fur, checked their breathing, then lifted her head toward Daniel. The look in her eyes was not animalistic rage. It was gratitude, raw, unmistakable gratitude. Yet even as the fire warmed the room, the storm outside grew fiercer, hammering against the cabin walls. Daniel knew this was only the beginning. The wolves had found refuge, but survival was not guaranteed. And as he met the mother's gaze again, he realized something with bone-deep certainty. He was no longer just a witness. He was part of their fight now. For a long time, the cabin felt like two worlds colliding. Daniel's familiar space, filled with human order and warmth, and the wild, trembling family huddled on his wooden floor. The storm outside howled like an ancient beast, rattling shutters and piling snow against the walls. But inside, an even more astonishing scene unfolded. The mother wolf didn't prowl or sniff about as Daniel had feared. Instead, she curled herself neatly around her pups, keeping them contained near the fireplace, her massive body serving as a living shield. Every movement she made was careful, purposeful. When one pup stirred and whimpered too loudly, she quieted it with the gentlest touch of her nose, as if to remind it that this was not their territory and they must respect the space. Daniel could barely believe what he was seeing. His mind screamed that this was impossible. Wild wolves didn't act like this, didn't understand boundaries or human belongings. Yet his eyes told a different story. When one pup stumbled toward a chair leg, the mother intercepted it instantly, guiding it back to the blanket with the same patience a parent might show a restless child in a stranger's home. Then came a moment that made Daniel question everything he thought he knew about animals. The wolf's gaze shifted to a stack of old newspapers near the fire. With deliberate care, she nosed one across the floor and pressed it beneath the damp bodies of her pups, as though understanding they needed more insulation. She repeated the action, layering paper beneath them until the floor was dry. The intelligence behind the act sent a chill through Daniel's spine. It was too precise, too intentional. Hours passed in uneasy stillness. The storm battered the cabin with relentless fury, but inside, the pups began to stir with renewed energy. Their shallow breaths grew steadier, their trembling eased. One by one, they lifted their heads, blinking weakly at the firelight. The smallest whined softly, and the mother immediately responded, wrapping her tail over them like a blanket. Daniel's fear slowly gave way to awe. He found himself inching closer, unable to resist the magnetic pull of what he was witnessing. The wolf tracked his every movement, her eyes sharp but not hostile. When he crouched and set a bowl of water near the pups, she hesitated, then glanced at him, almost as if seeking approval, before nudging her little ones forward. To his astonishment, the pups didn't rush or lap greedily. They waited for their mother's subtle signal before taking careful sips, avoiding any spills. The order, the discipline, the awareness, it was too human-like, too deliberate. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. He was no longer looking at wild beasts. He was looking at a family, one bound not just by instinct but by something that resembled reason. And then, as if to push the boundary of belief even further, the wolf turned her attention to Daniel's cat. Whiskers had been hiding under the couch since the storm began, wide-eyed and rigid with fear. When the cat finally crept into the open, Daniel braced for chaos. But instead of lunging or growling, the wolf pulled her pups closer, rumbling a soft sound that quieted them. The cat froze, then cautiously padded across the room. The wolf lowered her head in a gesture so unmistakably peaceful that Daniel nearly forgot to breathe. Whiskers sniffed the air, circled once, and, against all odds, settled near the fire, only a few feet from the wolf and her litter. Daniel leaned against the wall, struggling to process it all. He was witnessing something no one would believe without proof. Wild wolves didn't seek shelter in human homes. They didn't bow, didn't discipline their young to respect boundaries, didn't make peace offerings to cats. Yet here was playing out in front of him with each passing minute. As the pups grew stronger, their behavior mirrored their mother's restraint. They didn't scatter across the room or chew at furniture. They stayed close, quiet, obedient. When one accidentally toppled a small stack of books, the mother picked it up delicately with her teeth and set it back down, then nudged the pup with a sound that could only be described as a gentle scolding. Daniel's eyes stung. It wasn't fear making his heart pound anymore. It was something closer to reverence. He had always thought of wolves as dangerous, untamable forces of the wild. But what he saw now was different. Intelligence, awareness, respect. And beneath it all, something even deeper, gratitude. Then, as the storm outside reached its peak, the mother did something that stunned him into stillness. She rose slowly, approached Daniel, and paused just an arm's length away. Her eyes met his, steady and unblinking. For a moment, neither moved, the air thick with an unspoken understanding. Then, with impossible gentleness, she lowered her massive paw onto his boot, pressing it there just long enough to carry undeniable meaning. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't dominance. It was thanks. Daniel swallowed hard, tears pricking his eyes. He had never felt so small, so humbled as he did in that moment. He wasn't just a man in a storm sheltering wild animals. He was part of something extraordinary, something that blurred the line between species, between instinct and understanding. And as the wind screamed against the walls and the fire crackled in quiet defiance, Daniel realized this night would change him forever. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that the most astonishing moment of all was still yet to come. By dawn, the storm had weakened, leaving the valley blanketed in a silence so pure it felt almost sacred. The cabin, however, still carried the weight of the night's impossible encounter. The pups, now warmed and lively, nudged each other playfully under their mother's watchful gaze. Their strength had returned, but so had her urgency. The mother wolf rose slowly, stretching her long frame with deliberate care. She padded to the door, then looked back at Daniel. Her eyes held no trace of fear, only clarity. She pressed her paw gently against the wood, leaving a single frost-marked print, and then turned to her pups, as if signaling it was time. Daniel's chest tightened. He knew this moment had to come, but the thought of them leaving filled him with a hollow ache. These weren't just wild creatures anymore. They were a story etched into his very soul. The mother gathered her pups into a perfect line. One by one, they approached the door, their movements astonishingly measured. The smallest paused first, glancing back at Daniel before lifting its tiny paw and pressing it to its chest, then extending it outward in what could only be described as a gesture of thanks. The second followed, mimicking the motion but adding a small bow, its ears dipping low. The third let out a soft whimper, the sound carrying an uncanny echo of human gratitude. Daniel's breath caught. He could barely process what he was seeing. These weren't random actions. They were deliberate, coordinated, purposeful. And then came the mother. She stepped forward with regal grace, her paws silent on the wooden floor. She approached Daniel slowly, her gaze never wavering. With careful restraint, she lifted her massive paw and placed it on his arm, just for a moment. The weight was firm but not threatening, a simple, undeniable mark of trust and gratitude. Then she backed away, bowing her head in a gesture so full of meaning that Daniel's vision blurred with tears. Before leaving, the mother turned once more. With her pups lined neatly behind her, she raised her paw high, holding it there as though offering a final salute. And in perfect unison, the pups copied her, creating an image so breathtaking, so impossible, that Daniel had to grip the doorframe for support. The family stepped out into the fresh snow, their tracks forming a straight, orderly path that vanished into the white horizon. They did not scatter or rush. They moved as one, dignified and calm, as though carrying with them a promise of respect for the man who had saved them. Daniel stood in the doorway long after they disappeared, his living room silent but forever changed. On the floor near the fireplace lay the newspapers the mother had carefully arranged, the blanket tucked neatly where the pups had rested, and near the door, a single, perfect paw print left in the frost. Proof that the night had been real. That image would haunt Daniel, not with fear, but with wonder. He had not simply sheltered wolves. He had witnessed something that defied science, instinct, and expectation. Something that proved the wild held mysteries humans were only beginning to understand. And as he finally closed the door, one thought burned brighter than the storm ever had. He would never see the world or its creatures the same way again.